we move on to the second session of today's afternoon component of the Understanding China conference. We are going to be talking about green transition and innovation ecosystems. So I would like to welcome for this component Belinda Schäpe, China Policy Analyst for the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Brief introduction about my organization, the Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air. We're an independent think tank founded in 2019, and we work particularly with data and evidence-based analysis at the nexus between energy transition and air pollution. We do that across a number of key geographies, and we have a very strong team on China. Also other regions in Asia and Europe you can see on the map. But yes, particularly on China, this is what I'll be talking about today. I lead our work on climate diplomacy and outreach and engagement, but we broadly cover China's power sector transition, energy transition, industrial decarbonization, air pollution, and we provide some of the most up-to-date data on China's emission trends. When we talk about China, one of the things that most people know is that China is the biggest emitter of global emissions. It accounts for 30% of global emissions, and since last year, it's also the second largest historic emitter, overtaking the EU and just after the US. But what I want to show with this graph is it's really interesting to also see the last 10 years of China's emissions growth, because China has accounted for nearly 3/4 of the emissions growth over the last decade. So in other words, without this growth, emissions may have been somewhere entirely different. So it's really crucial to see these more recent trends in China's emission trajectory, but it will also be quite crucial to see how the next decade is going to shape that. And it just shows us how important China's climate transition is for global climate action. On the next slide, one of the questions I often get asked, what is actually driving China's transition? Like its energy transition, its climate transition, what are the drivers behind that? And I want to highlight four main drivers. One of the origins of China's climate policy was actually quite closely linked with air pollution, because after China came out of really strong economic growth since the 1980s, in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of the environmental destruction that came with it and the price that the country had to pay. And one of the starkest was air pollution. And for many of you who have been to China, this is nothing new. I think the past few years have been a lot better, but many of you will remember the really, really heavy smog, and that affected many, many people in China, and it became a key priority for the Communist Party to tackle. And of course, that's closely interlinked with emissions more broadly. It's not only air pollution, but a lot of these also link to greenhouse gases. So this was one of the strains on why China decided to transition. The other one is also climate risk. China is one of the countries most vulnerable to climate change. We have seen a lot of reporting on the droughts and floods, sea level rise that China is already experiencing, and these are becoming more and more intense year by year, and are starting to really become an economic burden and a national security risk. So this has also become, a really key national priority for the government. The third one links to energy security concerns. Traditionally, China has been rich in coal, but poor in oil and gas. So it's quite reliant on imports of fossil fuels, particularly for oil and gas, but still also for coal. So transitioning away from fossil fuels is also a way for China to decrease that dependency. And this is where we've kind of seen the focus on really manufacturing clean technologies for the future to then have a hold over these supply chains and not be dependent on imports from other countries. And that links very closely to the last point, economic opportunities. China has really taken this from a very long-term perspective. Discussions around clean technologies and new energy vehicles becoming national priorities were already there in the early 2000s. So this is nothing that came overnight. And a lot of opportunities for China to leapfrog, for example, in the automotive sector, where it became quite obvious that it wouldn't be able to catch up with European or other international manufacturers. But that would look different if we look at a different technology, in this case, battery electric vehicles. So the economic drivers behind it are really key, a key component in China's energy transition. On the next slide, please. So for the last 4 years, we have done a progress report looking across different sectors. What are the developments in China in terms of its climate transition, and how do they fare against pathways that would be aligned with the Paris Agreement? We've just published our newest report 2 weeks ago. So if you're keen, feel free to have a look at that later. I'm going to share a few of the key highlights that we found about this year and look out to next year, what our expectations are and what we're looking out for. On the next slide. So contrasting with what I said earlier about the growth of China's emissions, what we've been seeing over the last 18 months is that China's emissions have actually been flat or falling. And if you look at this graph, this is not necessarily new, it's not necessarily revolutionary. 5 times in the past, China's emissions have already fallen. But what is new this time around is that in the past, it always came with an economic contraction. So energy consumption being down, electricity consumption being down, and therefore emissions coming down. But this time around, we're actually seeing very strong energy and electricity demand and a decent economic output. And yet emissions are starting to level off. And this is in large part because of the renewables build out that we have been seeing over the last couple of years. On the next slide, we'll see that for the first time now, renewables are able to meet more than the electricity demand increase. And this is really interesting to understand because in Europe, electricity demand is relatively stable. It's not growing very fast. But in China, electricity and energy demand are still growing very rapidly, faster than the GDP growth over the last couple of years. But because of the renewables build out, renewables are now able to provide more than this demand increase. And as a result, coal power is decreasing. So the share of coal in the power mix has reached the lowest historic levels this year. On the next slide. So that's why we're kind of starting to talk about a structural peak, because we're really seeing a shift across different sectors and across the power sector, importantly, in terms of emissions. So emissions are falling in the power sector, in the transport sector, and also in the cement sector, which is really positive, how you see on the left. But they have not fallen overall just yet, because there are still a few sectors where we're seeing growth. That's particularly the case this year in the chemical sector, where we've seen a lot of increase in demand in oil and coal. And output more broadly, that leading to emissions from the chemical sector. And we've also seen a relatively slow transition in the steel sector, where electrification is really not taking up at the pace that it should be. So that's why overall we'll probably see flat emissions this year and them not just falling yet, but we're really seeing very positive trends in a number of key sectors that are quite structural. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go in detail on all the different sectors, but this is just to give you a sense of how we mapped different indicators and how we compared them over the years. You see that this year the picture looks a lot greener than previously, but there's still quite a lot of reds and quite a lot of challenges. So overall, quite positive in the power sector, in the transport sector, but still a lot of challenges in industry and buildings. Next slide. And one of the things that's perhaps in contrast to this relatively positive, even though mixed picture, is that despite emissions leveling off, China is on track to miss a number of key climate targets for 2025. The most important of those, I would say, is the carbon intensity target. So this kind of means more or less the CO2 efficiency. So how much CO2 emissions are emitted per unit of GDP. So it's kind of the idea of decoupling emissions growth and energy growth from GDP. And that's where we haven't seen as much progress in the last 5 years, and where China's likely to miss the target for this year. And that puts a lot of questions on the overall trajectory of China's climate transition, because to still achieve the targets for 2030, the government will have to do a lot more work over the next 5 years, and there will have to be very clear policies on how to enforce that. And beyond the carbon intensity target, we're also seeing the coal consumption target and the targets for new coal capacity being missed, because even though the government promised that it would strictly limit or control both, we've seen a huge increase nevertheless. So you see, it's quite a mixed picture, and there's a lot of difficult decisions that the Chinese government, but also provinces and companies will have to make in the next 5 years to kind of balance this growth in coal and renewables and make a decision on which one is going to go forward. Next slide. So I'm going to go briefly into a bit of the details on coal and then on clean. As I said, traditionally, China has a lot of coal capacity, coal-like resources. So its power sector and industrial sectors have been built on coal. That's quite different from many Western countries. But we've seen a particular impetus again on coal in terms of energy security concerns coming out of 2020 and 2021. In those years, China experienced severe power shortages nationwide, similar to the ones that we saw this year in Spain and in Portugal. And of course, as you can imagine, those really scared the government. And while the issue wasn't that China didn't have enough coal capacity, there were numerous other issues at play that I can go into more detail if you're interested. But the response of the government was to encourage more coal permitting and more coal build-out. So what we saw then in 2022 and 2023 was a flurry of new permits. 2 new coal power plants were permitted per week on average in those years, and those are now being built. So we still have quite a big pipeline of over 200 gigawatts of coal capacity that's supposed to come online in China. And as a result, we're likely to see this year a historic high of new construction starts and new commissioning. I'm saying here since 2015, that was the case for the first half of this year. It may be a historic high since old times at the end of the year. We will see. But you can see how that's in a really stark contrast to this pledge that President Xi Jinping made personally in 2021 to strictly control coal power projects and coal consumption, because we can see that clearly hadn't happened. On the next slide, we see that this very much contrasts with international trends. So while China is still adding new capacity, in the rest of the world, it's actually going down. So we've seen the global coal fleet outside of China shrink by around 9 gigawatts in 2024. And as a result of that, China now accounts for more than 90% of new construction starts in coal power. So it's really an outlier compared to what is happening in the rest of the world. This is so much for the coal side of things, but let's go to the next slide to talk more about the renewables side of things. And hopefully you've already discussed the many contradictions that come with analyzing trends in China. This is one of them when it comes to the energy transition, that China is not only building coal at a unprecedented scale, but it's also doing that with renewables. And in particular, since 2020, we have seen this massive expansion of clean energy installations, both as you see on the left graph, but also in terms of manufacturing, here represented by solar cell output. You see that every year in the last 5 years, we have seen a new record high in terms of solar and wind installation, and this year will be another one. Next slide, please. So just to add a few numbers there, last year China added more than 350 gigawatts of solar and wind capacity. That's more than the rest of the world combined. So China is really the game when it comes to renewables build out. And for the first time this year, we're seeing that renewables capacity is actually bigger than fossil fuel capacity overall. So even though coal is still growing, renewables are growing faster. And as I mentioned earlier, as a result, they're also generating more electricity than is actually needed. So the coal as a share in the power mix is dropping. And I do want to highlight this, and we'll come to the economic side in a second, but it's also really important to remember when we talk about how China is dominating the manufacturing of clean energy technologies. That's true, and that's a risk, and we come to that. But it's also important to see that in the context of the installations that are happening in China. China accounts for the majority of the manufacturing, but it also accounts for the majority of the deployment. So a lot of it goes into the domestic market. And next slide, please. So this is a nice chart from the International Energy Agency where we can kind of see how big a player China is when it comes to investments into energy security, clearly leading ahead of everyone else. But importantly, as you see in this green bar, also really leading on the renewables investments. Next slide. So obviously, it's not only about decarbonization, but it's crucially also about manufacturing. So China has made a huge bet on this clean energy manufacturing, and we're starting for it to pay off. The one thing I want to highlight outside of the power sector is the automotive sector or transport sector more broadly. And I think this is another one where we've just seen rapid development over the last 5 years. So while 5 years ago, the share of new energy vehicles in new sales was around 6%, this year we're reaching more than 50% for the full year for the first time. And this also translates then into the manufacturing of electric vehicles, which has grown another 30% year on year this year, while the manufacturing of conventional combustion engine has come down by 2%. So you can see that these two trends are really starting to converge, and it's going to be only a question of time when electric vehicles or NEVs, so including also plug-in hybrids and others, are going to overtake conventional vehicles also in terms of productions and certainly in terms of new sales. And the same is true for batteries as well, where China's made rapid progress in terms of developing new battery technologies, and where we see a lot of competition between different companies for, creating the best products and driving down prices. Next slide, please. I was saying that it's starting to pay off, and that's what we're seeing, that clean energy technologies are becoming a crucial driver of China's economy. Last year, they contributed around 10% of GDP. That's roughly almost $2 trillion US. That's becoming hugely important, and it's a sector that's very dynamic. So we see much faster growth there than in China's economy overall, 3 times faster, and contributing around a quarter of the economic growth last year. Interestingly, for the first time, this has also overtaken sales and value in the real estate sector, which is kind of like the traditional bedrock of China's economy. So they're really becoming a crucial driver, and they're also becoming an important component in contributing to China's GDP targets. So without these sectors, China would have missed its GDP targets last year. And as we know, GDP targets for China are really crucial. So these sectors are coming to the forefront also of strategic planning. Next slide, please. Our assumption or our analysis shows that there's also a lot of potential in the sector to double in value over the next decade if we see a continued build out of renewables capacity and a continued export growth as well. We assume that this could contribute around $4 trillion US by 2035. That's about as much as Germany's entire GDP today, just to put it a bit into context. And importantly, as such, if this were to materialize, these sectors could contribute around 20% of the targeted GDP by 2035, which is quite a crucial year in China's economic planning as it plans to become a moderately prosperous country by 2035. Next slide, please. And so I think what we are seeing, we can kind of call it China's Great Rotation, where we see the shift away from the real estate sector and those heavy industry sectors towards manufacturing, and in particular high-tech manufacturing, where clean technologies play a crucial role. So there's a really strong economic impetus of clean energy projects, despite the weak returns that we're seeing, because there's very strong political support from the central government and also a lot of local and provincial governments that are looking for new opportunities of growth. Next slide, please. So what we are seeing is that the central government is also starting to take credit for this development. President Xi announced those dual carbon goals back in 2020, and this year he said that since he has announced these goals, China built the world's largest and fastest growing renewable energy system and the world's largest and most complete new energy industry chain. So we see very closely how these climate and energy targets are being interlinked with industrial policy planning. Next slide, please. There's a lot to learn on how China got there. I think sometimes we become a bit lazy and just talking about subsidies. Those played a role in it, but it's much more than that. And if we want to really understand how China got there and take lessons from it, I think we need to go beyond that subsidy conversation. It's really about how China successfully created this environment for these industries to grow. And there was a mix of factors, from providing long-term strategic policy direction to infrastructure development to low cost and highly risk tolerant credits to free or nearly free land access and resources. And of course, there were direct subsidies. And of course, there was also cheap labor. But I think it's really important to understand that this was quite a complex industrial ecosystem that was supported by the economies of scale of the Chinese market and then network effects that came through it. This is not to argue that China is unique and it can't be done in any other country. I don't think that's true. But I think there's a lot in there for us to really dissect and understand these different factors and what led to it, for us to think through how that may be replicable in other countries as well. Next slide. So I think for the next 5 years, we're coming to some more internal contradictions, because it's really becoming a question now whether to either cut the coal industry or cut clean energy industries. And recently, the policy signals that we've heard from the central government don't really give us a good indication of where this trend is going to go. But yeah, as I said, there's a very clear economic impetus for clean energy. So the long-term trajectory is clear, but in the short term, there's still a lot of frictions. And of course, just building out renewables won't be enough. It really requires a whole system effort of reforms in the power market, in grid infrastructure, and storage. And this is all faced by other vested interests that the country has. For example, a very, very strong coal lobby. So these internal contradictions are coming to a bit of a head over the next 5 years. Next slide. Internationally, China is starting to play an more and more important role. So these clean energy technologies are, of course, not only limited to the Chinese build out of renewables, but we're seeing a really big impact, like a really big footprint of China's both clean tech exports, but also investments into new clean tech manufacturing. So our analysis suggests that through these investments and exports, China has contributed to cutting emissions outside of the country by around 1% last year. And this is a growing trend. Next slide. It's really interesting to analyze China's clean tech exports, though, because I think when the US tariffs first hit, there was a lot of discussions on how that's going to impact the Chinese clean tech sector. And the answer was not very much because the US is not a very big market for most of these. Like the solar market in the US is around 4% of the global solar market. But instead, half of China's clean tech exports now go mostly to countries in the global south. And interestingly, this is also where we see like the most growth in export volumes over the last couple of years. And the IEA projects that emerging and developing countries will continue to be the main drivers in terms of market growth throughout this decade. So that's really interesting to watch. And also ask us very honest questions of what the impact is that our policies can have. But on the next slide, we also see that Europe still remains a really important market for certain clean technologies from China, importantly EVs and batteries, as you see on these slides, but of course also for solar and wind. So I think for Europe, we're in a really difficult situation, right? Where we're about to make decisions on how we're going to structure our energy transition and make it safe and ensure that we're not falling into new dependencies, but at the same time also make the most use of clean and good, cheap technologies that are coming from China. So I think it's a really a balancing act. And there's a lot of difficult decisions for us to make here on how we handle this and how we maintain fruitful trading relationships with China on clean technologies, while at the same time also developing our own markets in areas that, yeah, are going to be driving our clean energy transition. Next slide. I'm going to briefly talk about China's role in the multilateral negotiations. I think this is kind of where we've seen this dynamic really come out very clearly this year. China entered the negotiations in a really comfortable position with the US out of the picture. There wasn't a lot of pressure on China to do more than just show up and show that they're still committed to this. This is what they did. And they very much portrayed themselves as this clean tech superpower that's basically providing cheap technologies to the rest of the world and thereby enabling the global energy transition. So a really comfortable position for China for now. This will probably change over the next coming years, where we'll likely see more countries having higher expectations of China doing more than just that. But it was really interesting to see how that kind of really shifted and how the Chinese pavilion was dominated by a lot of SOEs and Chinese private clean tech firms showcasing their newest solutions and their technologies. Next slide. So I'm going to briefly have a few words on the forward-looking trends, and then I'm really keen to get to your questions as well. But this year, China announced its new climate targets for 2035, as all countries under the UNFCCC had to do. It was a big moment because it was the first time that China announced absolute emission reduction targets that cover all greenhouse gases in all sectors. And it was announced at the highest level by President Xi Jinping personally. But when we look in a little bit more detail into these targets, we see very quickly that they're not quite aligned with what we need for the Paris Agreement just yet. So China committed to reduce emissions by 7 to 10% compared to peak levels. That's far below the 30% emission reductions that we would need to see over the next decade. And there's also an issue with this from the peak levels, because it basically creates a dynamic where we're seeing like a storming to the peak trajectory. So where different stakeholders and provinces are more or less encouraged to grow their emissions as much as they can before this undefined peak, because it becomes easier to come back down afterwards. So this is a bit of a challenging environment. And then also when we look into the sectoral targets, they're quite conservative. So the target of 3,600 gigawatts of solar and wind by 2035 may sound like a lot in the context of many countries, but for China, that's actually very conservative and would mean a dramatic slowdown of the build out that we have seen over the last couple of years. So on average, we would see only around 200 gigawatts being built out of solar and wind every year, compared to, as I mentioned, the more than 350 last year, and probably close to 400 that we'll see this year. But there's this one small side sentence that I think should give us a bit more hope, which is striving to do better, which really situates these targets as a start for a conversation. I think we should very much see them as the bottom line, with a lot more space of ambition to grow over the next decade as China kind of readjusts some of these targets based on the trends that we are seeing on the ground. Next slide. Yeah, this just shows you where we would kind of land on this trajectory based on these targets compared to what is needed to align with a 1.5 scenario. You see it's still possible to achieve carbon neutrality in theory by 2060 with this, but it makes it much harder because we need to cut a lot more emissions much steeper later on. And we all know that kicking the can down the road is usually not a very good strategy. Next slide. Nevertheless, I think we're still more optimistic that China is going to overachieve these targets, because across these sectors, we see positive trends that could, in fact, enable these 30% emission reductions. I won't go into too much detail on this. I'm happy to chat more if that's of interest in the discussion. Next slide. And I think we're also optimistic after we surveyed some Chinese experts on this. We found that 2/3 of our surveyed experts were confident that China would either significantly or partly overachieve these targets, which is really positive. But on the other hand, they were a lot more uncertain about the short term. So even though we've seen emissions kind of leveling off now, they weren't so sure that this would be the peak just yet. And many of them expected that China may peak actually only in 2028. So this kind of still leaves a room for some emissions rebound and also a risk of this. They were still confident that China would still achieve its 2030 targets. And I think interestingly, the majority of them think that the current and future economic and geopolitical environment is actually conducive to making these climate targets more important. So this again shows us how closely interlinked this planning on the climate and energy transition is in China with the industrial thinking and industrial strategy making. Next slide. So yeah, briefly, just because we're coming to the end of the 14th five-year plan this year, the 15th five-year plan is currently being drafted. You may have discussed this in earlier sessions already. It's coming out next year in March. And from a climate and energy perspective, I think the two key priorities that were mentioned in the recommendations on building a modern industrial system and accelerating high-level science and technology self-reliance both go hand in hand with some of the developments we're seeing in the clean tech sector. We still see this having quite a high priority and for the government to have a vested interest in those sectors. But there's a number of open questions that we're still looking for answers from this 15th five-year plan, which are around this carbon intensity target that I mentioned. To what extent will it be in line with the targets for 2030? What will China's clean energy targets for over the next 5 years actually look like? Will there be an absolute emissions cap? How will the situation look like in the coal sector? To what extent is coal consumption going to peak and then also decline? The same is true for oil. And to what extent is there going to be some limits on new coal capacity as it's still being added, even though the utilization is going down? And one of the sectors, as I mentioned earlier, the chemical sector, where we're seeing a lot of growth, to what extent will that growth be sustained or will it be reined in by the government? Next slide. Just to summarize, I think there's quite a lot of uncertainty when it comes to China over the next few years. When we look at missing these key climate targets, when we look at the policy environment, a lot of these will hopefully become more certain once the 15th five-year plan is out. This is also the nature of this period where we are in, where we're just waiting for the high-level guidance. but there's still a strong economic imperative for this momentum to continue. And briefly coming to the EU-China dynamic on the next slide. I think for Europe, there's still a lot of challenging questions to be asked as we see the transatlantic relationship being really reshaped. There's a lot of new challenges and also opportunities of engaging with China. But in climate and energy transition cooperation more broadly, I think we're really seeing those geopolitical tensions playing quite a big role, and the trade tensions really overshadowing some of the cooperation mechanisms that were built over the last couple of years. So I think there are 5 things that we can consider moving forward. The first one, I think, is really like this kind of long-term thinking and learning from the Chinese in that sense of the value of having long-term policy direction. This doesn't mean that everything has to be set and we're just going to do it that way. There can be a lot of implementation and like back and forth during the process. But I think the recent rollbacks that we have seen in the EU's green policies have created uncertainty rather than incentives for the industries of the future to really flourish. So I think there's quite a high risk for us there. The second one is, despite the high trade tensions that we're seeing with China across sectors, this is nothing new to any of you. I think it's really important that we engage proactively with Chinese counterparts on this and try to find common solutions to these problems and make compromises where we feel like we can. Both countries, or like both Europe and China, want to benefit from green economies in the future and see an opportunity there for us for economic development and growth. So I think it's crucial that we'll overcome some of these bilateral tensions and we'll find ways forward, even though that may be challenging. But having that dialogue is really crucial. And at the same time, I think it's still important that we also go. The previous session talked about de-risking. I think the same is true for our energy systems. We shouldn't be reliant on one single country for strategic technologies. And there are ways to enforce that and ways to incentivize production from other countries through, for example, percentage-based import limits in close alignment, of course, with international trade rules. And the other side of that is the fourth point, in working with other countries around the world and building these diversified and resilient supply chains that we need for clean technologies. Europe certainly has a role to play in that, but there are many others out there as well. India and Indonesia have made huge progress, so has Vietnam and others, and they're all very keen to work with Europeans still. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for us to do that in a proactive manner. And the last thing I think still relates to European manufacturing. I think there's a lot of opportunities in attracting investments from leading Chinese companies that are keen to have production facilities here as well. And there's a lot to benefit in Europe from that input and from technology transfer. I think it will be crucial to set up a clear framework that really benefits local production and local economies, also doesn't create a member state competition dynamic, but I think there are ways to do that, and there are ways for us to think this through. Next slide. So yeah, just to conclude, and really keen to get into more of a discussion then, I think for China, it's a really complex green transition that it faces, and as you see, there's a lot of back and forth happening. But the underlying direction is very clear. Xi Jinping has termed it as high quality development's color is green. I think we should take that quite serious, despite this back and forth dynamic. This is the direction of travel that China sees. And of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, we see a very different direction with the current US administration turning its back on the decarbonization agenda, locking in more fossil fuel production and looking for markets for this. So I think in Europe, we're at a bit of a crossroads to either continue relying on fossil fuel imports, even if it comes from the US rather than Russia, or continuing to rely on cheap, clean technologies from China, or in a much better scenario, really double down on our own efforts to see how our own industries can support the transition while we're working with international partners, including the two above, to make it work. So yeah, last slide. Thank you very much, and looking forward to a discussion and your questions as well.
Thank you very much, Belinda. I believe it was a very interesting presentation showcasing also the intricacies of a green transition of a country that portrays itself as one of the, let's say, drivers of the green transition worldwide, while at the same time relying heavily on carbon. So that's definitely an interesting take. And I would like to open the floor to questions coming from the audience. I see we have a first question coming from Esther.
Thank you very much, Belinda, for the interesting presentation. Indeed, from what we see, there seems to be quite a strong policy momentum towards advancing China's decarbonization goals. And from an industry perspective, in certain industries, as you mentioned, and as we know, the momentum is also very strong. At the same time, from the perspective of European industry in China, we do see that in the past couple of years, companies have been heavily impacted by the economic headwinds in China. And what we're seeing as well is that one of the impacts that we have observed from these economic headwinds is that more respondents of our business confidence survey are reporting that they are postponing their decarbonization, like their decarbonization targets. So, for instance, instead of like 2030, they're saying that they're moving their targets to 2040. So I wanted to ask you, how do you assess the impact of again these economic headwinds on the behavior of industry in China, not only European companies, but also Chinese companies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Certainly, I think, globally, the election of Donald Trump and the change in the direction of the US administration had significant impacts. And unfortunately, what we're seeing at the moment, if we think of waves in terms of how the green transition fares, we saw a huge uptake when the EU first announced its Green Deal, and then China came out with its dual carbon goals, and the US was on it as well, and many, many other countries around the world. But at the moment, we're kind of like going back to a lot of backlash, and where there's uncertainty around this, where we've done a lot of things and realized that some things couldn't happen as fast as we wanted to. So I think that's where this kind of uncertainty comes from, that a lot of things turned out to be harder to actually implement than we perhaps expected. And because we've also reaped a lot of the low-hanging fruit when it comes to decarbonization and are coming into a really implementation of these targets, into a phase of implementation where we're looking at deep decarbonization of industry as well, where we're still challenged by not only technological opportunities or technological solutions, but crucially also like the financial viability of this. I do think, though, the long-term trajectory should be quite clear, and different companies shouldn't think that this is now something of the past and we're moving into a different direction again. The economics just don't play for it. Renewables have become so much cheaper over the last 5 years and so much more available. And decarbonization has actually made so much progress in the real economy that to think that we can go back to just a business as usual scenario and delay our ambition, I think is quite risky. Certainly when we look at a few sectors where we've seen the most changes, such in the automotive sector, I think it's very risky for the EU to extend the ban of the internal combustion engine from 2035 to later. It just means that the industry doesn't have to make the changes as fast as they would have needed to otherwise. But that means that China's just going to gain more progress there. And I don't think it's really a solution for us long term. And I think the same is true for other industries. So I hope that many companies will stay the course, and will see kind of the long-term implications rather than jumping on this current like backlash that we are seeing, because I think, yeah, it comes in waves and there will be another wave again, I hope.
I would like to once again thank you very much, Belinda, for your insightful presentation today. I believe it's been extremely valuable for us to get more information about the fundamental topic that is the green transition, and also to understand how the EU and China should also balance, let's say, their trajectories of growth in the future as well on this.